You're listening to the Deadly Uncle Podcast,
a safe space for Deadly Uncle conversations.
All right, welcome everybody to the Deadly Uncle Podcast. We got a different setup today because Curt could not make it here in person, so he's here. He's just not in screen yet. You'll hear him. But today we're here with Kyle Napier. Now, Kyle is from the Northwest Territories. He's part of the Métis Nation. He's an instructor, researcher, and media maker. So, Kyle, why don't we start things off? Why don't you give us a little background about where you come from, your background, and the kind of work you're doing in the community now?
Masi Kyle Napier Sulye Tapachatine Hesli Kulu Drizane Kwaichon Asler. I'm from Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, Tapacha, and now I'm living in Quaynede, the big city, Edmonton. So down south here for now for studies, for PhD studies. It's going really well, and focusing on language work for language policy development and education, language delivery in the classroom for Indigenous nations, governments, schools, in that type of education facet. So, and then my community where I'm from, I'm a member of Northwest Territory Métis Nation. I grew up in Salt River. I grew up in Fort Smith. I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up in Calgary. So just kind of a mix of those three, I think, are my big upbringings. And then, so community has so many different broad forms and interpretations and definitions, and so I belong to a lot of different communities, but my home, my family, that's all in Smith. It's all the Bolios, Laffertys, Mercadees that I know of in South Slave, Northwest Territories, and Denende, south end of Denende, and then or Denende's hair, really. It doesn't need to be north and south. but yeah, it's a bit about me, where I'm from, and just communities that I'm a member of.
You're an instructor at the University of Victoria, NorQuest College, and the University of Alberta. Can you maybe give us a little background on the type of things that you're teaching right now?
For each school, I teach in different areas. So at U Alberta, I teach ethics and law and teaching. So I teach teachers K-12. I've never taught K-12. I've done IT work for K-12 schools, and I've run collage workshops for K-12 schools. But I'm not. I don't know. I'm not cut out for K-12 teaching. I can't. Kids are brutal. Kids are tough, and I like teaching teachers. I like teaching kind of adults because there's a reason that they're there. They chose to be in that level of education, so often they're a little bit more focused. So, I want to teach someone that wants to be there, So, so that's what I teach at U Alberta. At UVic, I teach in the Department of Linguistics in the SILR program. So their certificate in Indigenous Language Revitalization. So I teach my students what a little bit kind of what you do. Some of them create podcasts or vodcasts, and some of them create digital archives. And we review policy work for language reclamation. We review best practices for language reclamation. I got a big 8 books just on the mentor apprentice program, right there. And then, but that's not the only one. There's 10 different approaches, 10 different methods at minimum. And so that's what I do at UVic, and at NorQuest I teach in areas of Indigenous social policy and law. So whether for health and wellness this semester, or in kind of harder form, Indigenous social policy, just Indigenous effects in criminal justice program, right? Overrepresentation, decarceration, recidivism, those types of topics, and then decolonizing health and wellness. So it's a broad area. I love talking about it. I love all my students. They all kind of bring different perspectives, and I teach a lot of international students and a lot of Indigenous students. So it's people that are Indigenous to elsewhere, right? Where so they start sharing on their let's say traditional medicines from Punjabi, India, or from Thailand, or from the Philippines, or Rwanda, or wherever, right? And so we have really deep discussions about global TRCs, about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, because Canada's not the only one with one. So what does that mean in this kind of global conversation around colonization and decolonization and de-Westernization?
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. That is quite amazing. So, growing up, and by the way, this is Curt Young here. Hello to the Deadly Uncle podcast and all the people listening there. Thank you for tuning in. Just, it sounds like you grew up with your language. Was your language spoken at home? And tell us a little bit about your journey.
It was not spoken at home. I heard Esja, I heard Wahwe. I grew up with both Dene and Cree. Like in a Dene and Cree community is Dene Cree Métis community, majority Métis, but that's where their ancestry is Dene Cree and like mine, and so I didn't grow up with that at home. My grandma is a residential school survivor, and so my mom is one generation removed, and I'm two generations removed, and so I didn't grow up surrounded by my language at all, other than just like a little bit of slang in community here and there, but not enough to speak it or understand it. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, I was in my master's. Well, no, I'll start in 2012 with my language journey. So I was down south from Tipacha, from Smith. I just finished working at a friendship center, and then I applied for school because I applied, and I got into journalism because I wanted free concert tickets. Because when you grow up in small community, there's not a lot of concerts, And it's like, oh man, like concerts are so cool, and you see all these artists, and so that's why I went down for selfish reasons, and I got concerts in spades, like so many. I've because now I do audio visual for shows. I do run soundboards and run mixing boards, so I do constantly at concerts now. And there was about probably 7 working years of where I was doing audiovisual for concerts. So like Tuesday night, Thursday night, I just like 12-hour days, just like constantly doing shows. So I got that. But it was about halfway through my journalism degree. I was like, oh shit, like I got to go back home. I can't be a music journalist in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. We have like one concert a year. Like that's not a stable living. And so I was like, well, what's the most important issue affecting my home community? And I just lost, some friends, relatives, a number of folks to suicide, and suicide was becoming pretty prevalent. So I realized, okay, that's a drastic issue. It disproportionately affects my, Indigenous peoples and a little bit my home community too. And just like the further north you go, the rates are higher. And so I was like, well, what can be done about this? And realized that it was the connection to language and culture, that there was a connection to that. People that were connecting to their language and culture were less likely to commit suicide and had higher feelings of self-worth. And actually every other health indicator increased except for one. If people are connecting to their Indigenous language, one health indicator does not get better. Rates
Which
of
one?
smoking.
Oh,
Cigarettes.
rates of smoking?
Yeah, because they're hanging out with the elders.
That's because tobacco is sacred to some people.
That's right. So as a, I don't know if it's a fun fact, but it's a fact.
Fun fact: cigarette smoking goes up with connection to culture.
So anyway, some of my students learned that in their best practices class. So anyway, so halfway through I realized, okay, that's an issue, and that's a way to solve that issue. And so then I moved back home. Informally, I did trades for a number of years. Like I was a plumber for 2 years, and I did HEO for a little bit, and then so I moved back home, did road construction for a bit until winter, and I was like, same thing happened to me. I moved back. I was a plumber. I moved back to the subarctic, and I didn't want to do plumbing outside minus 45.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, so I started working with Friendship Center, and then so that same thing. Got my journalism degree, moved back, and then I was doing heavy road construction, and then winter hit, and I was like, this again. So so then found an office job, and then worked with my nation for I don't know, about half a decade, I guess, and around as doing your communications and research, so communication and research manager with NorQuest Territory Métis Nation, and then language work at the same time. So got involved, had to spend a pretty good budget in a short amount of time on a lot of language projects, and so it's kind of like the throw it at a wall and see what sticks or whatever. And so tried everything. We tried video games, we tried movies, we tried cooking shows, we tried events at the youth center, and it was about like popularizing wanting to reconnect with your language. So that was that's what it was about at first. But now I've learned since, okay, you have to pivot that. You have to meet people at their interests, right? There's all these different stages of language reclamation. you know, what do you do? Um, the the beginner, you have the intermediate, advanced, fluent, right?
Yeah.
Emergent, even at the beginning of that. And so, but very like you know, for people that are connecting to their language, it's usually they can get resources up to beginner, but then they can't really move past beginner with the resources at intermediate, advanced, fluent. Like there's transcripts of fluent speakers, so that's like high level fluency, and then there's like books of nouns, but very rarely is there like books for creating sentences. And so it's like, okay, that is what needs to get done. It's like this bridge from beginner learners, because like youth want to learn their language, right? Statistically, youth
Yeah.
are interested in reconnecting to their language, but there are less and less accesses for them to do so. So we need to meet them there, you know, at that interest. But that's where there's a gap in available resources.
I find it really interesting how you're able to kind of bring together media and language together and find interesting ways to engage the youth, because I think that's really important. There's a organization here in Calgary called USAY, and they do all kinds of things like that to engage youth. They do like what's that escape rooms and different stories and virtual online things that they really get the youth involved in. And I think that's the missing piece for a lot of people to reconnect to language, is finding that way, like you said, to connect them first to it where they're at, and then finding that bridge. That's really cool.
USAY is great, by the way. They run excellent programming.
Yeah.
And so with my language journey, it was about, I was, you know, so I was working with the Cree language program at the time, right? Sakâw-nêhiyawêwin, Bush Cree. And so I was like getting okay with my sakâw-nêhiyawêwin, not like good, like not conversational. But with now, about halfway through my master's, I told my, an elder that I've visited with often, the first time her and I met, there was a video game that I was involved with, and it was a language learning video game. And at the end of the game, you learn 10 nouns, right? So at that time I wasn't privy, right, to 10 nouns. You're not going to learn your language. You're not going to. I was like, we need questions, we need dialogue, we need interaction. So I even knew that presenting it to her. I was like, hey, I want to invite you and representing Dene Dedlıne Yatı to share this, your words for this video game. She's like, really critical. It was the first time she's like, no way. She's like, it's not going to work. No one's going to learn their language from this. And she was right. Like, it's just spent all this time, about an hour and a half, playing this game, and you only learn 10 words. Like this, and you're not even in sentence. So she told me about halfway through my master's. Well, I asked her. I visited with her and I shared some medicine with her, and I was looking for guidance on what I should write about with my thesis. And she said, you should write about our language. And then I looked it up and I was like, wow, no linguist had really actually formally written about our language, other than Dr. Young Do Cook, who'd gone up to the region where we're from. But a lot of
Yeah.
linguists, they've written about Dene Dedlıne, but not Dene Dedlıne. So Dene Dedlıne is K dialect, but we are T dialect. And there's like a tenth as many speakers in Dene Dedlıne. So Dene Dedlıne, lots of people know about Dene Dedlıne, Chippewan, but we're T dialect Chippewan, Dene Dedlıne Yatı. And so that was the thesis. We wrote about it, identified it, geolinguistically located it. And then, and that began my Dene language learning journey. I'm more Dene than I am Cree, but I'm Métis, like I'm
Yeah.
and then so anyway, just really, really connecting with her, visiting with her often. We're in our third year now of mentor apprentice program, and it's going really good. Like I have my test coming up in like a week or two. I have to talk for like 45 minutes and all in the language, and so it's going
Wow.
good. Yeah, so it's really going good. I can vouch for mentor apprentice program. It's really been helpful for our language learning. And I just want, like, anyone who's listening who wants to reconnect with your language, if you're motivated, if you're interested, like just try, even learn one more word just today, and try to get your verbs in there. Really try to create sentences. Do what you can. Watch videos. There's usually something always out there, and watch podcasts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, get motivated. So anyway, that's where I am now, and with my language learning journey. And me and my fiance, we're actively learning our language. And just last night, we're up late reading dictionaries, like really. Chiptionaries, yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, yeah. But
That's
that's
amazing.
yeah. How about
That is
yourself?
totally
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah, Trent. Trent, what about you? And then Curt, I want to hear from you too. Like, what are you? I know you talk about language lots on this podcast, but what about you and your own language connection journeys?
I grew up in Red Deer. My Indigenous family is from Cowessess First Nation, and my grandparents both went to the Maryville Residential School. So did my dad, and day school there as well. And we were Soto speaking. There's a little bit of Métis in my grandfather's background as well. His mother was Métis, his father was Soto, and then my grandmother was Soto. So they didn't speak in the house. My grandmother grew up speaking Soto, and so did my grandfather. But when they went to school, they stopped speaking, and they didn't pass it along to my grandfather. I mean, to my dad. So therefore, it kind of went down to us. And I've learned a little bit online with online resources, because there are quite a few, like you said, for the Soto language as well. So I've begun that a little bit, but I'm not too far along in that journey for sure.
Yeah, just the very, very, very beginning for me too. I'm just starting to learn also the Plains Cree, and then also some Soto as well on my side, because we had Soto. It was a big part of our my mom's side of the speaking language. So and one of the things I will say is that my mom just turned 70 this year, and she really is starting to recognize some of those words that she grew up with when she was quite young before she went to the residential school. Both of my parents went. And, George Gordon's First Nation, where we're from, there was still a residential school open in 1996. So it's kind of still recent. But she said that, learning just some of those words in Soto, just even, anin, just hello, and are bringing her back to her childhood and really making her feel like her life is just beginning. And it kind of brings me to my next question for you is, why do you think it's important to archive, and to do what you're doing in the work, and to mix in that digital? Why is it important to do that?
Oh, I'm an interesting person to ask about that, but because I don't have full faith in the digital. I think it's a conduit. It's like a piece of paper for us now. And we as Indigenous peoples are not strangers to new technologies. Even in terms of early adoption of technologies. I mean, there was bilingual, like English and Indigenous language newspapers in the early 1800s, right? We created our own orthographies in the early 1800s, 1830s, right? Syllabics, and then had all these different ways of writing it. And in fact, for many different Indigenous communities, right, we had higher rates of literacy, right, than non-Indigenous communities on this continent for a long time, and so maybe not digital, what I'm most advocative for, but certainly the use and critical use of these technologies, right? Whether it's newspaper, whether it's radio, whether it's podcast. But with regards to archival work, is that you really have to be aware of how fragile archives are, digital archives, physical archives. Even like I was saying about archives that, whether it's flame or fire, flood, flare, or messing around, like whatever theft, is that archives are really sensitive, and so you can't really put your trust in them. You have to do your back and forths. Even you have to be careful of malware these days with your digital archives, right? And it's pervasive, and it'll sit stagnant in your archive for like a year. So even if you're doing backups, digital backups, you might have malware all in your digital backups just waiting for a release date. So I've seen it happen, and I know of nations where that's happened with, and I don't need to say which ones, but it's you have to be really, really careful. So I'm actually more of an advocate of the physical, but just constant upkeep of physical archives. Right now, my Elder Eileen Beaver, who's my mentor apprentice program mentor and mentor in life too, in a big way, and my language teacher, and the one who was guiding my thesis and all this. Um, well, she told me about halfway through that master's, she said, "You need to develop a video game in our language." Remember, that was how we first met. Was I
Yeah.
introduced to her, and we were both critical about it. Well, now we're working on a game that does foster dialogue. It does have, sentence completion, and it uses actions and verbs in context of environment. And so you can hunt, you can trap, you can fish, you can snare, you can pick berries, you can pick medicines, you can do colors. Like there's a character who's blind, but he rents out wall tents, and so you might want to make sure everyone's got their correct wall tent color. So people like purple, people like green wall tent, people like whatever wall tent. So so you got to help this guy out, whatever. That's a color aspect of the game. But so digital's fun, but you have to, and in terms of meeting youth or meeting accessibility or meeting other barriers to people looking to reconnect with their language, digital can be that conduit, but you have to be very critical of it. And there's a lot of great theorists in the space. Dr. Candace Gala, right, Hawaiian language revitalizationist, who is very critical of digital technologies, but that's her specialty, is digital technologies for language reclamation. So it's going forward with that critical framework, critical adoption, and making sure that it's something that's appropriate for you, the community work you want to do, the language work you want to do. You have to always ask those questions and be prepared to put those so-called service providers to the fire and ask them, are you going to uphold this commitment in 20, 30 years, right? If you upgrade, do we have to pay for that? Or you have to ask, what are you doing with our data, right? Where's the data stored, right? If it's American servers, right? For anyone that's listening to this, if you've been involved in land defense movement, your data, if it's in American servers, the U.S. is just going to have clear, easy access to it because of that Patriot Act, right? So you have to be very careful these days with digital management. So anyway, yeah, I'm not necessarily pro use of it, but it's a tool. And just like any tool, it's about how you use it.
Now, you said something before we started the podcast that I thought was really interesting. You were talking about intellectual property and how we never gave up intellectual property rights during the treaties. Can you maybe touch on that a little bit and explain what you mean there, and maybe explain what intellectual property is to some of the listeners out there that may not know?
Intellectual property was never signed away in treaty. And intellectual property, like the way that the colonial government sees it, right, that there's copyright, trademark, patent, and there's trade secrets. Well, when it comes to Indigenous intellectual property, we need to stop pretending that it was signed away in treaty. And in fact, I'm looking forward to seeing some type of large class action lawsuit against Canada over the centuries-long theft of Indigenous intellectual property. So what is intellectual property? It's knowledge. It's knowledge in all its forms. It's according to Canadian copyright law, whatever you create, this recording, right, this is your intellectual property. So elders and knowledge keepers who were recorded 100 some odd years ago, that intellectual property is maintained by the original person recording it. So knowledge keepers being recorded by ethnographers and technologists, well, those knowledge keepers no longer retain the right to their knowledge under Canadian copyright law. Not that
it's
knowledge.
Whoever recorded it, right? Okay.
So you own this, right? I don't own this. Yeah, this is your intellectual property, even though I'm talking and blabbing my face off over here, right? And so it's really interesting. And then of course there's patent and trademark, but and we have patent and trademark. It's what you painted inside your let's say your teepees or the inventions, right? Inventions are different. Even the intellectual property of a trap line, right? Land-based intellectual property. And I'm a really big advocate of intellectual property for land defense. You can look at Peter von Tiesenhausen, for instance. He's non-Indigenous. He grew up in, I think, where he did major art, at least in central kind of northern Alberta, somewhere in there. And because he was an artist, he had this big tree fell in his yard, and I don't know, 40 feet, maybe 50 feet. I saw it in an art gallery, and he dragged it out to a specific area of the yard. He's an artist. That's copyrighted. Now, oil and gas tried to run a pipeline through his his acreage farm kind of deal, and he said, no, this tree is protected by my copyright. I'm an artist. I laid that out. The way that I laid that out is my art. And then they couldn't run oil and gas through his copyrighted art.
That's cool.
And he said because they were coming up to him and So Peter von Tiesenhausen told him, "You could talk to me all you want." He said, "My rate's $500 an hour." And he said, "Talk to me."
I got to remember that line. That's good.
And he maintained that. And then so anyway, they talked to them for how long? And then he sent them a bill and said, "No, we can't run it through my land." And then, but we need to exercise that. Why are we not, right? When our lands, our reserves, our bands, our governments, or wherever.
Yeah.
So that's one way. And then another thing people need to know about culturally modified trees, CMTs. Any tree that pre-exists 1847, if there's signs of human using that, so like making it for canoe, birch bark basket, like whatever creation, indigenous creation, that's a CMT, culturally modified tree, and that should be a protected area. I don't know, but you need to be careful about what is a protected area and who's protecting it, right? Is it the feds? Yeah, right? Are they going to remove people from that land, right? All that. So that's CMTs. Another really big case, these are my favorite three with intellectual property and land defense, is the Delgamuukw case. And I had the privilege of meeting Jean Joseph, who is the primary librarian. And you know, she's from those lands. I think she's from Wet'suwet'en. And then so they put forward the first time that intellectual property was used in the Supreme Court, and it was a song. It was the use of song, and you know, the song position, the way that it was sung, you had to be in a specific place, and it pointed in one direction. It talked about the mountains in this direction, the ocean in that direction. Right? It talked about kind of positionality and area, and then and so it established their connection to those lands. So even use of that song in intellectual property that and used for land defense and land ownership, land claims. Yeah, so those are my favorite three. There are others, but so intellectual property is more than just your copyright and what you type on a computer, what you work with, your own songs, but it's the knowledge of your community, and it's coded in your language. That's another beautiful aspect about relearning your language, is that you relearn all of this ancestral intellectual property. But here's the thing, right? Okay, so we talked about copyright. Patent is your inventions, trademark is like your identifiers, but the last one is the big one, and that's trade secrets. And so trade secrets they are protected as long as they are a secret. And most Indigenous knowledge still falls under that trade secrets aspect. And so, right, anyone listening to this, anyone, if you know people 100 years from now, 300 years from now, if there's still protected, sacred, secret, or sensitive Indigenous knowledges, what's being done to not only keep it protected, but also that transgenerational sharing, right?
Yeah. That kind of just set off like an explosion in my brain when you're talking about trade secrets, and where you're kind of wary of digital media too, because now by allowing people to record this knowledge, this no longer trade secrets, right? Is that kind
That's it.
Yeah, like it just kind of, my brain just went because that's I can see why you'd be wary with digital, a little bit wary with digital when you're okay, sorry, I'm just connecting all the dots mentally for myself.
Yeah, it's like constellations. You start to realize it's all connected, right? When you learn your language, you reconnect your language. It's you're decolonizing your mindset, your worldview, your how things came to be, how you justify, how you create knowledge, your ethical conduct, and even just how you carry yourself in the world, and so realizing we never signed away our intellectual property in treaty or ever, those are never clauses of modern comprehensive land claims or any of those, and so I'm very interested to see what happens in this space, and I think more people. I really want to see more interest in this space from concerned Indigenous peoples, whether it's knowledge keepers, land users, hunters, trappers. Like, this is important for everybody.
Even content creators, people creating content, right? Like you have to be wary of what you're doing now, because you could be adversely affecting some of those things moving down the line. So it's a lot to think about now, actually.
Yeah, totally. I'm really, really happy to have you on, because there's a lot of people that don't realize this and don't know about it. And even myself, I was really wanting to capture the elders from my home community and some of that knowledge, And how did we get to this area? What is your stories and all that? Because we have elders that are passing away every day, and it's like I just wanted to collect that knowledge, and now that I'm a part of this, I'll definitely keep all of that in mind. And wow, I had no idea. I'm just like Trent. It just kind of blew my mind there. And I also wanted to ask you. You were talking about the different dialects when it comes to the languages. And when we think about the Plains Cree and the Northern Cree, there's slightly different ways of saying things, and that'll kind of change sometimes our ceremonies and way of seeing the land. And so I just kind of wanted to ask you about that. Is that the same when the dialects are slightly different?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, yeah, I'd say there's probably just those subtle differences among dialectic differences, but when you start going from language families or languages themselves, yeah, you'll notice a big change, right, in worldview. And there's commonalities, but there's those distinctions too. So, okay, yeah, like so you're talking about like your sakâw-nêhiyawêwin, so that's Y dialect, eh?
Kurt?
Kurt?
What's that? Sorry, excuse me. You left me behind.
Okay. Your Y dialect, your sakâw-nêhiyawêwin?
I can't even, I don't know. Like, I'm from the Plains Cree, and so we speak the Plains Cree. I know, like, my cookum used to speak a little bit of Michif, but it is like mostly Soto.
Oh yeah,
That
okay.
yeah.
So so with that, yeah, so Plains Cree, sakâw-nêhiyawêwin, that's Y dialect, and then where I'm from is Bush Cree, sakâw-nêhiyawêwin, that's U dialect. And so even in terms of representation, right, neither of those languages, which are languages that those are the indigenous languages of my ancestry, neither of them, the federal government didn't look at either of them. So neither Bush Cree nor Dene Dedlıne were really observed with distinction. And so it's funny, they tend to lump it all together, but there's clear differences. And even you start looking at dialects, but then family and community dialects too, right,
Yeah.
amongst itself. So that those have historical changes over time too, right? Each has their own kind of distinct histories. So yeah, I'd absolutely say see that. Now I have a sharing for you, which is so Gerald Petra from back home, Tibacha, Quitnukkaskewawin, as they would say in Bush Cree, a northern portage.
He's a
Um,
musician, right? I know
he is
Gerald.
yeah, North Country Rock.
Yeah.
Right on. Okay, I'm glad you know him. That's cool. It doesn't surprise me. And so anyway, I was talking to him about language once, and I was just about to leave his office. He was working with I don't know if he's still there, but he was working at the Aurora College at the time, and I was just about to leave. Exe maga, all that, right? Quitnukkasko or sorry, Quitnukkasko. And he said, "Kopum tim wastas." I said, anyway, he said, Jesqua, and he said, you know, he said back in the day, he said, when he's like, he's like, I remember this now. And you were both talking about silent speakers, right? Those that carry the language, they grew up with it, but then whatever happened, trauma, residential school, whatever other feelings around their language, interpersonalized feelings against it, whatever, there's a lot of silent speakers, right, who maybe for 50 years haven't spoken their language or really heard it around them, and when they do, what awakens in them. But anyway, Gerald said to me, oh yeah, he said, there's one thing I remember. He said back in the day, if you did something nice for an elder and they liked you, they would say "Kakika kaki pamatsun." Kakika, forever. Ka, like will. Ki, you. Pamatsun, live. Forever you will live. Oh, just nice. Kakika kaki pamatsun. But if you did something nice for an elder and they didn't like you, they'd say they'd say it like this, just fast. Kakika kaki mamatsun. Like that. Kakika kaki mamatsun. You're gonna be ugly forever. So, but it would sound nice. So even sense of humor, right? Sometimes people are way too serious about like language revitalization
Yeah.
and intellectual property, but I mean, humor is the guiding force, right? What is it that motivates you? And that's not that is right of our communities is right, even our ways of healing, right? Humor has a big aspect. It's not pills and hospitals all the time, right? It's our peoples.
Well, some
Yeah.
people don't realize. Oh, go ahead.
I think my cookum called me the second one a few times.
What I was gonna say, Kyle, is like a lot of people aren't really aware of like how much different language there is. Like, I worked on the Dene Nation radio show, just doing audio editing for them for a while, and just I wasn't aware that there's so many different Dene dialects. Can you maybe expand on that? Like, I didn't understand like the Tsuut'ina and the Navajo were part of the Dene Nation as well. Like, they're similar language speakers, right? Can you maybe touch on that a little bit?
So those are both not Dene, right? Tsuut'ina and Navajo, the Dene, right? There's the Dene
Yeah.
down south. But honestly, okay, Dene Dedlıne Yatı, the language I'm connected to, and Navajo Dene language are so close that when Eileen Beaver and I, she's the elder that I work with, when we were trying to remember, we were trying to look up a specific word because for this video game, one of the playable characters is a bee, and that bee can go around and it can pollinate plants, and then you can get different medicines and all this. Really cool character. But we didn't. I was like, what's the verb for when a bee goes to pollinate? Because I was like, I know what that is in English, or you call it pollinate or whatever,
Yeah.
but we didn't know it in the. And I tried looking up all these dictionaries. We have probably 3-4 dictionaries for our language, and couldn't find it. And I was like, oh, you know what? Let's check Navajo dictionary, and that was the one. She's like, oh yeah, that's the word. So even that connection, right, bridge of how many thousand kilometers away, and then and it being so linguistically similar that even the word for a bee which is pollinating, that's the same word. And so anyway, like looking to like world views, who is it? United Nations says there's 7,000 different languages, and that the last speaker of a language dies every 2 weeks, right? So they
Oh,
said,
wow.
yeah. So by 2100, they said about half the languages that are spoken now will be spoken by the year 2100, right? Because this global linguistic imperialism, and it's just going to keep getting worse and worse unless people do something about it. And so they say there's 7,000 languages, but you start considering dialects, you start considering like slangs at home or communities like that, and even just neologisms or new words that are created. So you have like little new pop-up dialects everywhere too. And so there's a lot of languages and a lot of dialects. It's more than, I believe it to be much more than 7,000, considering right who's been erased, who's been not looked at, who's not included in global records, all that. And each of them has their own worldview, their own way of thinking, and we are condemned in English to an English way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's one about ownership. It's one about the self. It's about like that those degrees of like, oh, that's mine. That's a very possessive language, or my this, my elder, my can you really own them? And so like what that does to you linguistically to think in those ways, right? And so to think, okay, if English is just one worldview, just one way of thinking, and you've been thinking in that your whole life, well, what happens when you start opening your eyes back to your other languages, right? Language of your lineage, language of your home, or and that brings up a lot of pickles too, a lot of new weird situations where people are, let's say they, if it's not a language of their ancestry, but they, grew up in foster care, they grew up in whatever, they grew up in a different community, and they start learning languages which are not of their ancestry. And so even what that means, right? So people end up in sometimes really tricky circumstances where even non-Indigenous people, right, where they're thinking, is it okay for me to learn the language? And I've seen, of course, discourse on it and people debating it, and honestly, it used to be that the Indian agents and the nuns and the priests were all, they all spoke the language too, and that was so that they could control people. But now we're taking it back, we're reclaiming the language. It's not about them controlling us, even by right, even in our, for our medicines, right, from the sakâw-nêhiyawêwin, from the Plains Cree perspective, they had to rename their medicines as a community. So like sweetgrass, sage, cedar, all that, tobacco, all that is they demonified the medicines by language to protect it. right, to protect that as kind of intellectual property, even because it was banned, right, through the Indian Act. So they called it something else in their language so that the nuns would leave it alone, that they wouldn't realize what was going on.
Okay.
And so they called it, like, demon weed or whatever, and it was, but that was just to protect it. And so you start thinking of all these things that happen with the language, and then even the demonification of plants and our relations. But now we have this opportunity to reclaim it on our own terms, and now is the time. This is the most critical period to do so.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Wow. Just like I said, it's so it's an honor to have you on today and to discuss this. And it brings me to my next question. When they talk about our accents, a lot of the elders that I've spoken to, Elder Longman from the Plains Cree, he was telling me about the accents and saying, in the old days, they thought it was because we were actually less intelligent, but actually, it was the opposite way around. It was that we had to slow ourselves down to speak a much slower language. That there's full stories and full ceremonies where there's not even one word in English to describe that, and it was actually the opposite way around, from us being not intelligent, but our language was just, it was faster, and we had to slow ourselves down to speak this language we call English. Can you talk about a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know too much about that, but I do know that with the Dene connection, in Navajo country, they talk about us in the north. They say, with my elder Eileen Beaver, when she went down around that area and she was introducing herself and talking, they said, "What?" Like, whatever. They asked her, "Can you repeat that?" And she did, and then they started teasing her. They're like, "It's true." They said, "You Dene in the north." They said, "You talk like you're a tape recorder running out of batteries." So you're
You
so I don't
slow
know.
right down.
So I don't know if it's just cold in the subarctic or in the prairies or what, but there could be all these changes in time. Right? You talk about thousands of years here, so
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Plus, there's so much
That is-
distance between those two. Like, the languages are similar, but they must have, evolved a little bit differently over time because they were so far apart, right?
You'd think, but yeah, there are more similarities than there are differences.
Oh,
So
that's cool, though.
yeah, it tells a lot in history that way, and even, right, the diaspora of all these languages, whether it's Soto or Nêhiyawêwin, right, going in the westward, and then Dene kind of being pushed and pulled and on all this different ways. So, and like I said, it's not just Indigenous languages on this continent too, right? Like, for anyone here, if you're more, if you're not Indigenous, or if you're connected to, I don't know, Gaelic or Scot, if you're part of a colonized history,
Yeah.
that you can connect to these other Indigenous languages of your home ancestry, and there's some like very severe geolinguistic and geopolitical connotations there. So, like, for instance, in Scotland, there's a recent policy put forward that banned fisher people from being in certain isles. Well, those are Gaelic Indigenous fisher people in those regions, and so they had very specific words and when fishing in those islands. So by being unable to fish in that area, you lose so much of that vocabulary that is central to those lands. And so, right, we start talking about paralinguistic policy, right? When they start removing us from our lands, from our trap lines, from our waters, all this, it actually removes you from your language too, because you have all of these language connections to those lands. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I actually went to Ireland last year to a folk conference, and I met this guy, and he started to talk to me, and I think as Indigenous people in North America, we kind of think of ourselves as maybe the only colonized people out there. We don't really have a broader perspective of it. But when we were talking there, he was telling me, all these castles, everything you see around here, he's like, these are not of the Irish people. He's like, these are the colonizers these are their things that they brought here. He's like, we were tree people, we were forest people. The British came here and they cut down all our forests and they put us in schools the same way they did in North America. He said, I grew up, I had to go to a British, Protestant school. And he's like, I was picked on for being Catholic. And he's like, it's just, and then he said, we have our own languages here. We have, our own customs and that kind of thing. And then it just kind of opened my mind. Yeah, there are definitely Indigenous people all across the world. And they've all, maybe not all of them, but most of them have suffered some type of colonization, right?
And so that's what my dissertation work focuses on. And so I'm in doctoral studies in education policy studies, specializing in Indigenous Peoples Education at U Alberta. Yeah. And so, very often in language revitalization areas, you learn about, mentor-apprentice program, you learn about language nests. And these are great programs. Like it's effective for me. I've been learning that way. You learn about, learn about immersion, you learn about Head Start programs. These are some of the more common approaches. And then, there's different methods for teaching too. Well, I'm quite interested in what global Indigenous communities are doing in terms of their own reclamation processes. So where they're not affected by even the education processes that we have here. Like I said, those mentor-apprentice, language nest, immersion, all that, Head Start. Well, what are they doing elsewhere in other parts of the world? And even how are they designing education, right? Do they have the cube of education that we do, where it's a classroom, and is that the best place to learn? Or are there other areas that are focusing in a more decolonial way? Like, I don't know what's happening in Brazil or Papua New Guinea or Japan or, all these, and I hear that there's some wonderful work there happening. Some of these nations are under civil war as well, so they're under these constant. It's a literal battle, and then at the end of the day, think about Rwanda, right? Think about Indigenous peoples in Rwanda and what's happened with them. So what are they doing, right? And so even Hebrew, right? Hebrew revitalization. That's has its own really strong story that we need to be inspired by. And so I spoke with probably the world's most renowned linguist, Noam Chomsky, and so him and I had a half-hour conversation, kind of like by video, kind of like this, and I asked him, I asked him 3 questions, and one was, what is the connection between politics and language? And the second was, what can a community like mine, who's undergone like residential school and 60s scoop, millennium scoop, what can a community like mine do about it? And then I asked him, what's the most beautiful thing about language? That's a more of a fun question,
Yeah.
And some of the big things every once in a while, I'll just recall some aspects of that conversation, and one of them is, he said, to look at global Indigenous language reclamation or global language reclamation as a whole. He said, look at Hebrew, look at Welsh, look at Basque, and the role in politics of that. And he was involved with the Wampanoag language revitalization, where for more than 100 years there hadn't been a speaker of Wampanoag. There hadn't been a first language speaker in Wampanoag, and then he was working with Dr. Jessie Littledoe, who is Wampanoag, and then Dr. Jessie Littledoe raised her kid to be the first language speaker of Wampanoag in more than 100 years. Oh, and so we there's so much beautiful work happening, and like you're saying, looking at the globally affected communities. These communities that are affected by colonization. Like you said, it's in continental. I don't even like to say North America. Sometimes I don't even like to say Turtle Island because Turtle Island is not true for all Indigenous nations here either, right? Yeah. So, but this continent anyway, that we're recording this on, and then like you said, you kind of focus on this and Hawaii, right? And kind of learn from ourselves, but we have a lot to learn from globally, and I think there's some global Indigenous partnerships that need to happen, and collaborations, and more learning from each other, and again more learning inward too of our own distinctions.
Well, Kyle, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. I mean, we're almost out of time here, so I want to turn to Curt and see if you got any more questions. I'm just my mind is so full from this conversation. I really appreciate you coming here today, because I'm going to have to go sit back and watch this again just so I can take in everything that we talked about. But thank you so much. And Curt, do you have any more questions for Kyle before we let him go today?
So just one last one. You're very well rounded in this conversation. You've done many different things. With journalism, with plumbing, with doing so many different things in your life. Are you at all into the arts? Do you sing? Do you play any instruments?
Oh hell yeah! So Trent, you started before we even started recording. You were playing guitar. We were in
Yeah.
this interim period, and so hell yeah! No, I played punk rock so hard we got banned from 4 venues. Uh,
Hey!
you know, so absolutely, right? Arts in all its ways, even like intellectual property play. So collage, right?
Yeah.
That's not appropriate in intellectual property spaces. I love to do it, and then so right, even reclaiming our own imagery, kind of like how like tribe. I don't know. Tribe Called Red had their own little contentions for a little while, but what they did right with video mixing, right, reclaiming identity in space, and so yeah, arts as healing, arts as language revitalization, arts as therapy, arts as everything. I mean, even how you live, right? That's an art.
Definitely a deadly uncle. That's all I gotta say. Thank you so
Oh,
much for
must
sharing.
see.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us today. That was amazing.
Hey, thanks for
Iawapa
inviting me
Mid
on.
Minawa.
Hey, Masicho, Masicho, you have a lot of really good deadly uncles on the show. I was going to ask you too. Okay, if we're not totally out of time,
Yeah.
how would you describe a deadly uncle?
I'll let Curt take this one. We had to actually answer this for CBC last year. They covered us a little bit on a podcast called Now or Never, and they asked us the same question. But I'll let Curt answer this one.
Uh, I would say a deadly uncle is somebody that's doing wonderful things in their community. Somebody that's a part of the community that's been through all kinds of journey. We've had people on this podcast that have been drug dealers and living on the street to employing in a cast of 10 people and running their own business to just everyday good dads. Nobody famous or anything like that. So a deadly uncle is just somebody who's a part of the community doing good things in their community.
Oh, so to all the deadly uncles out there, whether you're on the show or listening to the show, just keep at it, man. You got your everyone here. You're a good role model, good influence, and people look up to you, right? Whether or not you see it, whether it's the nephews, the nieces, small folks in your community, even some of the elders, right? They look to you too, and so what it means to be deadly, that framework of deadliness, however you define it or
You
describe it.
just coined something, that framework of deadliness. I think I need to make a T-shirt of that. The framework of deadliness.
That's good.
I just
Anyway,
stole your intellectual property.
it's yours. You recorded this. It's your IP anyway. Hey, Masi Cho, thanks for having me on. It's really meant a lot.
You're listening to the Deadly Uncle Podcast.
A safe space for Deadly Uncle conversations.
Next week on the Deadly Uncle Podcast.
And our on-air people are storytellers. So that's why we kind of got away from the 30-second, 60-second, do this. We're saying, okay, you're storytellers. You're that camp crier who walks around in the morning years and years ago at 4 o'clock in the morning, just as the sun was coming up, calling out what was happening during the day. So we're those camp criers.